The Xbow is a card you don't see much in Clash Royale nowadays. It's most famously known for being the most defensive card in Clash Royale, and if you know anything about Clash Royale balancing, you know Supercell typically keeps defensive cards in a worse position than most other cards. Nowadays, the Xbow's use rate is typically about 2%, with a win rate in the mid to low 40s in grand challenges, making this card statistically one of the worst in the game. But it wasn't always this way. The Xbow has had a flourishing history that has had a huge influence in the meta, providing a different way to play Clash Royale that was widely frowned upon by the community. A good chunk of people would probably tell you Xbow is their least favorite card as a result of the frustrating memories they have with it, which is likely why, despite the subpar rates, does not receive a buff. Its last balance change was in 2020 and has just sort of been phasing out since then. So let's talk about the history of this card, observe the decks it's been in, its ups and downs, observe the impact it's had on the game, and how it ended up where it is today. But first, we need to talk about Honkai Impact 3rd. Honkai Impact 3rd is a 3D crossover anime adventure game that features a vast open world by HoYoverse. The version 6.7 update just released, and there is a lot. The main story comes to chapter 38, where things have been happening in the Sea of Quanta. The connection between the two seals is no coincidence. This is a concrete manifestation of the Bubble Universe's background rules different from those of the real world, and this difference will certainly present notable challenges to our protagonists. Let's first talk about the new character, Shigeru Kira. She has a new battlesuit called Sugary Starburst, which is a mech-type ice damage dealer. She deals damage with pistols while also providing combat buffs to her teammates. There's also a new event called Perfect Performance, where captains get glow light sticks to boost stage preparation progress and grant combat buffs. They can play different modes to earn tokens, which can be used to exchange for a variety of items, including a new outfit. There's a lot more to check out, so make sure you download the game using the link in the description or the pinned comment and use the code KIRA for bonus items. The Xbow is one of the 42 OG cards in Clash Royale, meaning it's been in the game since the very first day of beta. This was one of the many cards inspired by a defensive building in Clash of Clans. The Xbow was one of the more expensive buildings in Clash Royale at 6 elixir, the same as the cannon and the mortar. The Xbow boxed out both of these buildings for obvious reasons. Although the cannon had more health than the Xbow had much more range, being able to snipe a princess tower from the user's side of the river. And although the mortar could also do this, the Xbow had a higher DPS and was the only building of the three that could target air troops. The cannon and mortar both saw little to no usage in top ladder, while the Xbow had a staggering 28% use rate. It could double as a defensive building and a win condition. It was considered to be a very strong card. Because of the 13 tile range it had, you could place it 3 tiles from the bridge and it would still reach the opponent's tower, allowing for defensive buildings to be placed in front of it while it shot the tower. It also had a deploy time of 3 seconds, forcing a very quick reaction because it could lock onto the tower as soon as it was finished deploying. And there was no way to stun or redirect the Xbow once it had already locked on. There was nothing like Electro Wizard or Zappies yet, and Zap and Lightning had yet to receive any sort of stun ability. It was incredibly stressful to play against, since even a fraction of a second too late was extremely punishing and could easily cost the defender the entire game. And of course, there was no Earthquake to deal with this building heavy meta either. This was also the reason Inferno Tower was quite strong during this era, and you would actually often see people using Inferno Tower to defend their Xbow. The Xbow wouldn't even remain in its original state for a month before it received its first balance change. On February 2nd, 2016, the Xbow would get 2 different changes. It would lose 15% of its hit points, meaning a rocket would now fully take it out. It would also lose its ability to target air troops, which at the time was certainly a nerf. But thinking about it long term, might be arguable that that's considered a rework, since cards like Lava Hound that would be added later could have been good counters to Xbow if it could still attack air. The cannon and mortar also got elixir reductions, leaving the Xbow as the only 6 elixir building. The Xbow was still quite good, maintaining a 16% use rate in top ladder after the balance changes. But only 1 week after this set of balance changes, the game would get another set of balance changes, nerfing the Xbow again. On February 9th, the Xbow's deploy time would be increased from 3 seconds to 5 seconds, giving the opponent much more time to react. This nerf was much more devastating than the previous nerf, and thus the use rate dropped to only 5%. The card certainly wasn't dead, but nowhere near as powerful as it used to be. Regardless though, a lot of people were complaining about the Xbow, pointing out how unfun the game felt with such defensive cards like Xbow being viable. It was not a card that made the game feel fun. Back in these days, overtime was only 1 minute instead of the 2 to 3 minutes that it would be later, and since there was no form of tiebreaker, it was common for a lot of matches that involved Xbow to simply end in a draw. To quote Supercell, they stated, "A core design philosophy of Clash Royale is offense over defense. We've always found gameplay based on attacking rather than defending to be much more enjoyable to play and entertaining to watch." Xbow was the antithesis to Supercell's balancing goals, so on March 23, 2016, the Xbow's range would be decreased from 13 tiles to 12 tiles, so you had to play the Xbow closer to the bridge in order for it to connect to the tower. This overall seemed like a healthy change because it meant you couldn't just put a hidden Tesla in front of it to completely block it while the Xbow hits the tower. It would require a bit more strategy to get value out of your Xbow now. The card was undoubtedly worse off with less range. It still had the same top ladder use rate as before though, so it didn't seem completely dead, but rather kind of niche. At this point in time, it was probably one of the most hated cards in the game, so there weren't exactly calls for a direct buff to the card. Only a few days later, on April 1st though, Supercell did something pretty crazy as a response to the Xbow hate. The change they made was now allowing your Xbow to target your own Princess Tower. If you paid attention to the date I said this happened on, you probably know why they did this. This obviously was just a joke, and actually wasn't in the real game, but on a separate build of the game exclusive to YouTubers who were meant to show off gameplay of this as part of the quote-unquote new update to bewilder the community. The question at this point though was, how was Supercell going to make such a defensive, frustrating card into something healthy for the game for the years to come? On May 3, 2016, the Xbow would get yet another nerf, reducing its range once again by another half tile. This was actually the intended range for the Xbow, as it was never supposed to be 12, so this was simply to fix that. But it certainly was not good for the Xbow in terms of getting it into a balanced state. After this nerf, the Xbow's use rate was officially down to 0% in top ladder, but this drop to 0 was likely more due to the buff the Royal Giant got in the same balance change, making him appear in over 1/4 of top ladder decks. The Royal Giant was extremely strong during this period, and this was not good for Xbow because the Royal Giant was practically a hard counter to the card. The Royal Giant wasn't going away anytime soon, so the Xbow continued to have trouble finding a spot in the meta. So in June 2016, the Xbow would get some slight reversions to some nerfs it had previously received to hopefully bring it back. Its deployment time would be decreased to 4 seconds, while also getting its original 15% health nerf reverted, now allowing it to survive a rocket once again. The card's top ladder use rate briefly rose to a whopping 2%, before falling right back down to 0. The Royal Giant was simply too dominant to give the Xbow any chance to thrive in this environment. The Xbow being so expensive made it less versatile overall. It actually became sort of a meme in the community that getting Xbows from a super magical chest was the worst luck you could have. Arguably, it might have been the worst card in the game, but grand challenges didn't exist yet, so it's hard to tell exactly just from ladder stats. For months and months, the Xbow would continually wallow at a 0% use rate, seemingly hopeless. But the Royal Giant would finally get a real nerf come August of 2016, which opened up some potential for the Xbow to make a comeback. Although you began to see some Xbow play by September, October is when things really would start to pick up for the card. Xbow rose from a 3% use rate to a 19% use rate in just 1 month. This Xbow deck was the most popular variation you would see and was the second most used deck in top ladder overall for October 2016. And 6 of the 8 cards in it just happened to be the 6th most popular cards at the time. This was a fairly cheap deck despite the Xbow being so expensive, the idea being able to quickly cycle to your Xbow so that the opponent's best counters were out of hand. Xbow may not have been the strongest card, but it certainly showed that it had potential. If it locked onto the tower just once, that was almost a guaranteed win for the Xbow player. However, by November, the use rate of Xbow dropped from 19% back to just 3%, and this was really just a factor of environment. In November, there was a lot less Giant due to the Poison nerf and a lot more Golem Lightning, which worked much better against Xbow than most other decks. Xbow Bowler was another variant you started to see pop up around this time, but it was never that popular. It was clear that the Xbow's main purpose was to thrive in cycle decks, which had a few different variants around the time. None of these Xbow decks could really compete with some of the more established archetypes like Lava Hound, Hog Rider, or Golem. However, the Xbow clearly had the potential to thrive given the right environment, and the coming months would prove this. In fact, in the December 2016 season, an Xbow deck finished in the #1 spot in the world. In January of the following year, Xbow would begin to make a considerable rise to 9% usage in one specific deck, which became the 3rd most popular deck in top ladder overall. But this was very brief, as it quickly dropped to just 3% before the month even ended. Going into February, Xbow evolved to include the Musketeer and Elixir Collector, rising to being the #3 deck in top ladder, and later in the month this Xbow deck rose to being the #2 deck. I found it really interesting that Xbow decks were often being seen in the top 3 decks, yet wouldn't appear anywhere else in the top 10. Xbow really only worked in very specific decks, yet thrived in ones it did work in. Unlike Golem or Hog Rider, where you'd see several different variants on the top deck list if they were popular. Despite all the different Xbow decks you would see pop up over time, the playstyle was very identical across them all. The Xbow player places the Xbow and buys the Xbow as much time as it needs by distracting defensive cards with cheap cards. Even if the Xbow only has a fraction of its health by the time it locks on, it's basically GG. Not to mention, the Xbow could also double as a pretty good defensive building. Cycling spells was also part of Xbow's playstyle. Fireball and Log were both very popular spells, almost always seen with the Xbow. Since most Xbow decks could be cycled through faster than other decks, it was easy to get 3 or 4 fireballs on the opponent's tower once double elixir hit in about 20 seconds. The Inferno Tower was often seen with the Xbow as well to deal great damage to tanks. This card was very important since Xbow was not a good tank killer, and cheap cards like Archers and Mega Minion were of course not meant to be relied upon for dealing with tanks. However, in March 2017, Supercell would accidentally kill the Xbow alongside a new update. Now there isn't a lot of details or information here, but I've put a lot of research into trying to figure out exactly what happened. I'll try to explain it the best I can. Basically what it seems like is there was a bug that severely increased the amount of time it took for Xbow to change targets. The way the Xbow would change targets was completely messed up when other troops were around it, killing troops that the Xbow was trying to target. This especially made it suck when it was going against Skeleton Army or Graveyard. This bug was only in the game for 3 days before it was fixed, so I couldn't even find any footage on YouTube of the Xbow during this brief period. However, the Archers were also affected by this bug, and as you can see, their targeting was completely messed up, preventing them from killing swarms of troops. This is basically what was going on with the Xbow. I wish I knew more about this bug, but unfortunately that's really all I have. This was only in the game for 3 days before it was fixed, and in the fixing process its hit speed was decreased from 0.3 seconds to 0.25 seconds. Its first hit attack speed was also decreased. 1/20th of a second may sound like nothing, but this increased its total DPS by 17%, which came to really help this card. As we go through 2017, the Xbow archetype would continue to widely stay the same, getting slight substitutions as the meta developed. You would see some dwindle in its popularity in the coming months due to Golem Night Witch, Bridge Spam, and Three Musketeers Heal dominating the game from May through the beginning of August. So in August, the Xbow would get a deploy time decrease from 4 seconds to 3.5 seconds. Also this month, Clash Royale saw its first ever 20-win challenge, and this Xbow deck was very popular in this challenge, having no defensive building, instead replacing the Inferno Tower with Inferno Dragon to take care of tanks, with the main advantage being that it's 1 elixir cheaper and every elixir counts when you're trying to keep the deck cheap. Although the deploy time buff certainly did help the card, Xbow was still pretty niche. At least it would be until October 2017, where one balance change would completely change the course of the card practically overnight. On October 9th, 2017, the hidden Tesla would finally get some attention in the balance changes. It was a card that for a while was considered to be awful, so it was time for a rework. It would hit slower now, but do 41% more damage than before. This change made the Tesla very strong, and it turns out the Tesla worked way better in Xbow than Inferno Tower or Inferno Dragon did. The Tesla wasn't as great as taking out tanks, obviously, but it still got the job done, and was far superior at picking off small troops than the Inferno Tower could ever hope to, especially given that it now one-shot minions. Not to mention it did have that unique ability to be completely immune to any form of damage when it was not attacking and hidden underground. So for example, if you had a Tesla and Xbow at the bridge and they rocket it, they could damage the Xbow but not hit the Tesla. Then you could cycle back to another Xbow and still have that original Tesla there to help. Xbow's use rate quickly rose in top ladder from 4% to 12%. These two decks became very popular. You had your standard fast cycle Xbow deck, but also this incredibly defensive Ice Wizard Rocket Tornado deck. Tesla definitely had more trouble dealing with the Golem than the Inferno Tower did, but it worked better in just about any other circumstance. However, the meta was certainly not done developing yet. This Xbow deck was floating around in challenges, as well as being used by a couple players in top ladder, incorporating the overpowered Goblin Hut. And you would still see a lot of Xbow with Elixir Collector as well. But towards the end of 2017, one of the, if not the most iconic Xbow deck ever would begin to rise. This would later be known as Xbow 2.9, consisting of these specific 8 cards averaging to 2.9 elixir. At the time, nobody could expect the long-term impact this deck would have on the game. It wasn't seen as any more special than any of the other decks at the time, but this deck was still unique. It was the cheapest Xbow deck that was popular, which allowed for a much faster cycle than any of the other popular ones. It was the most popular one in December and January the following year. You would still see Mega Minion instead of skeletons a lot of the time, but the skeleton variant was only becoming more and more popular as time went on. By the end of January, beginning of February, Xbow 2.9 was the number 2 deck in the game, spotted being used by 28 of the top 200 ladder players, just barely behind Mega Knight Zapbait, and the Xbow itself was up to a 17% use rate, almost exclusively appearing in Xbow 2.9. When we look at the Grand Challenge statistics from March 2018, Xbow 2.9 was by far the most popular deck. It had a 58% win rate too, which is very high, but there's also a stat that we need to look at to really determine the impact this deck was having. It's a stat that I've never brought up before, and that was draw rate. Draw rate is pretty irrelevant today since tiebreakers prevent this from happening most of the time. Xbow 2.9 had a draw rate of 12%, meaning only 30% of matches that Xbow 2.9 was played in resulted in a loss. A 12% draw rate was pretty high, but abusing the draw mechanic was part of the strategy of Xbow. It was so defensive, and some matches you just couldn't win, which meant the strategy was simply running out the clock. Also around this time, you were beginning to see a lot more substitutions of the Knight replacing the Ice Golem. This Knight variant had an even higher draw rate at 14%, and only 27% of the matches it was used in resulted in a loss for the user. The only decks that had a higher draw rate than this were Mortar decks, which coincidentally happens to be the only other siege win condition in the game. This deck was really starting to frustrate players as it felt impossible to break through, and the worst part was that it was just boring to play against. There was really no creativity when it came to playing this deck or against it. It was still essentially putting an Xbow at the bridge and spamming small troops to defend it. And despite this, it was actually considered to be the highest skilled deck in Clash Royale ever. I'm not going to argue in this video the level of skill it takes to play Xbow, but I just think it's unreasonable to consider a deck that only lost about 1 in 4 matches to be super high skill, especially because it was so popular. It definitely took a considerable amount of skill in some instances to maximize the value of the Tesla, Skeletons, and Ice Spirit, but as long as you learned a few basic placements, you could easily have success with this deck. Spell cycling was a very effective strategy with this deck because even though using a Fireball on nothing may give the opponent a 4 elixir advantage, you could easily earn that value back by defending massive pushes with very cheap cards. The deck definitely seemed to work better on ladder though, because the Clash Royale matches were actually structured a little differently, which made a big deal for this deck. In challenges, overtime lasted 3 minutes, however on ladder, overtime was only 1 minute, which led to many more draws which benefited the Xbow player. By now, the Mega Minion was phased out of Xbow 2.9 completely. The only slight variation you would see is the Knight for the Ice Golem. However, you would still see the Mega Minion appear sometimes in the Ice Wizard Tornado Rocket variant, which was still quite popular and some say was even more defensive than Xbow 2.9. In April, 2.9's draw rate only continued to rise and became the number 1 draw deck, surpassing Mortar now at 24%. It had a 40% win rate, which is usually bad, but it would still only lose about 35% of its total matches. Just to give you an idea of how high a 24% draw rate really is, just know that on this list of the top 20 most popular decks at the time, the second highest draw rate on this exact day was 15% from a Hog Rider Mortar deck, and nearly half of them had less than a 1% draw rate. By May, 2.9's draw rate peaked at 25%. Although certainly no longer the most popular deck in the game, was still very prominent and notable for how defensive it was. Also by now, remember that it's been the dominant variant of Xbow for at least 6 months. The next direct change to the Xbow would come in June, but it wasn't really a balance change, but just a bug fix to fix an issue where the Xbow wouldn't shoot troops at the edge of its range occasionally. Xbow had already been steadily declining in popularity for a few months now. One reason was due to the Ice Spirit in April 2018 getting a hefty nerf, decreasing its freeze duration by half a second and decreasing its damage. As we keep going through 2018 into 2019, we would see several more indirect nerfs to the Xbow. In June, we would see an Ice Golem health nerf of 5%, which obviously makes it absorb less damage. Also in June, 3-minute overtime would be brought to ladder, which was an indirect nerf to the Xbow since running out the clock was a big strategy for this card. But finally, challenge matches and ladder matches were a little more even, so Xbow wouldn't have this stupid advantage in one mode and not the other. In August, we would see a huge Tesla nerf, increasing its hit speed by 0.1 seconds and decreasing its lifetime by 5 seconds, which made the Tesla a pretty weak card. In September, we would see a total rework to the Barbarian Barrel, which reduced it to 2 elixir and still allowed it to to kill archers. It got a further buff in October, making it very meta. This made archers very weak during this era, and the barbarian barrel placed on an Xbow was almost guaranteed damage that could not only basically take out an Xbow for 2 elixir, but also absorb the damage it deals while the barbarian is taking it out. This month would also see a Royal Giant damage increase of 60%, which made the win condition competitively viable after years of being mediocre. The Royal Giant was already considered a decent counter to Xbow, but now with the extra damage it was even better. Considering all these changes, Xbow was in a pretty weak position overall. Several of the cards in this deck were significantly weaker than they were when Xbow 2.9 was first created, and now with Barbarian Barrel as a solid counter to Xbow and especially archers, and with it appearing in nearly half of all Grand Challenge matches, it was nearly impossible to win consistently with the Xbow unless you were really good. It still had a lot of potential, and Xbow 2.9 continued to see usage, but the win rate was significantly lower than its peak. In December of 2018, Tesla would get a slight first hit speed buff, and the Barbarian Barrel would be nerfed to no longer allow it to kill archers, but this did little to nothing to save the dying archetype. It was still the number 4 most popular deck in December, but still had a 46% win rate and only a 7% draw rate. The Xbow itself, though, only had a use rate of 3% with a win rate in the low 40s. It was an extremely niche card that could only work if you played a very specific deck and knew exactly how to play it, but even then, some matchups were practically unwinnable. Xbow just wasn't worth it for most players. Why pick up a deck you have to be amazing at just to succeed when the same amount of effort into Royal Giant, Three Musketeers, or Golem could get you much further? Xbow just wasn't fun or appealing. It was a different style of play that required a lot of patience and a lot more effort. Not to mention, Xbow was one of the least versatile cards in the game. Xbow really wasn't even viable outside of 2.9 Cycle or Ice Wizard Rocket NATO. I will mention there was one notable event in regards to the Xbow that happened in early December, where Xbow 2.9 made it to 90 wins in the global tournament, finishing in first place. This was due to an accidental buff given to the archers on December 5th during the global tournament, which gave them extra range. It was reverted shortly after the global tournament was over, but certainly was helpful to 2.9 players while it was active. This was actually the first global tournament ever, and lots of people were hyped to watch Xbow thrive live, thanks to the briefly overpowered archers. Overall, though, the environment was vastly different than it was in 2017, and the Xbow hadn't been involved in a balance change since August 2017. Icebow actually won the following global tournament that same month with an astonishing 117 wins, 25 higher than second place. As we go into 2019, the environment for Xbow would only get worse, so the question was, would Supercell directly buff this controversial win condition, or let it keep slipping out of relevance? The Xbow's rates didn't really change for the first few months of 2019, but in March, Supercell would directly buff the Xbow after over a year with no changes. All it simply was buffing its health by 4%. Even though it was a relatively small buff and the card's rates were already low, players were quite upset at this announcement. It may not have been in the best position, but it was really unfun to play against and was a card most people didn't mind being a little underpowered. Supercell has certainly kept many cards in competitively weak states in Clash Royale's history due to their mechanics being unfun and frustrating to go against when strong, but it looks like Supercell wouldn't be doing that here. This buff caused the Xbow's use and win rates to rise to more healthy rates. Ice Wizard Rocket NATO also became much more popular, but this buff was likely in preparation for a new card that would be coming out the following month that would not be good for Xbow players. April 2019 would see the release of the Earthquake. A previously outruled card would make its way into the Clash Royale arena, and this card's specific function would be to counter buildings. It did quadruple the amount of damage to buildings than it did to troops. This means it would take out more than half of the Xbow's HP for just 3 elixir. You could also damage the ground tower with the Xbow, dealing as much damage as a -1 level fireball would do. Earthquake wasn't too strong nor too weak upon release. It was actually quite a balanced card. Luckily for Xbow players, the use rate was fairly low, so it wasn't a huge worry for now. And remember, even at 1/4 of its HP, you can't really ignore an Xbow, so it's not like Earthquake was a hard counter. A few months later would be another very good period for Xbow. In August 2019, the P.E.K.K.'s range would be doubled, making it very strong. Now, why would some random P.E.K.K.A buff be worth bringing up in an Xbow video? Well, because the P.E.K.K.A was so meta-controlling this season, a lot of other archetypes simply weren't that viable. However, Xbow Cycle was probably the P.E.K.K.A's best encounter, so a rise in P.E.K.K.A saw a correlative rise in Xbow to deal with it. A nerf to the Barbarian Barrel also came this season, which was very helpful for the Xbow as well. Even Xbow Elixir Pump, or Pump Bow, was making a small comeback. The following month in September, even though the P.E.K.K.A got nerfed, the Executioner would go through some major changes, making it very strong. Nonetheless, Xbow didn't suffer too much during this period either, but it was interesting exactly how different the performance was depending on the section of the game you were in. By around the end of September, beginning of October, it had a 6% use rate and a 50% win rate in Grand Challenges. Pretty standard. However, in Top Ladder, it had a 9% use rate, which isn't that much higher granted, but the win rate was 49% and the draw rate was 12%. In Grand Challenges, that draw rate was 0%, meaning that Ladder had a much lower loss rate than Grand Challenges. It was significantly lower because at the end of September, Supercell implemented a tiebreaker feature, but exempted it from being applied to 1v1 ladder matches. The Xbow archetype was certainly the most affected by this tiebreaker change, since running out the clock wasn't enough to avoid a loss anymore. This new system wouldn't be applied to ladder matches until November. However, in October, the Elixir Golem would come out, and Xbow certainly suffered a lot during this era. It had worse rates from when it had 4% less health 6 months prior. It did recover after a few Elixir Golem nerfs back to a 5% use and 45% win rate by January. But now that tiebreakers were officially applied to ladder, some players initially expected this to hurt the Xbow quite a bit, but if anything, it did the opposite. This new rule rewarded Xbow players to sit back, defend, and not have to worry about taking a tower, making sure to consistently cycle spells and stay just a little bit ahead. I can assure you though, players were not happy about this new game rule and the playstyles that it allowed for. It was definitely controversial, and it was mainly due to the Xbow. In March 2020, the Xbow would be given an indirect nerf because now the Earthquake would be given the ability to deal damage to the Tesla while it's underground. This made little sense from a balancing perspective, considering the Earthquake was in a much healthier position stat-wise than the Tesla, and this change specifically was geared towards just this one card. From a logical point of view though, this did make sense, so Supercell went ahead and did it. Earthquake had been steadily rising in popularity for a while as a result of many different factors. Part of this demand for Earthquake was due to the rise of the Barbarian Hut and Bomb Tower in early 2020, and the demand would only rise when the Goblin Hut got a massive buff in April, causing it to be extremely overpowered. The Earthquake's use rate skyrocketed in April because of this, and the Xbow saw a correlative fall. Around this time, you were beginning to see much more of the Ice Wizard Tornado Rocket variant though. Rocket cycling was a go-to strategy when dealing with a constant flow of earthquakes. In May, the Earthquake got a slight rework which heavily favored the Xbow, because although now it would do 11% more damage to troops, it would do about 17% less damage to buildings. So even though this rework made the Earthquake even stronger overall since it was now in about a quarter of all decks, it was less effective against the Xbow now. Tornado got a rework in May, giving it much more pulling power and allowed it to deal damage to towers only at the cost of its duration. This rework did slightly hurt the card overall, but certainly not with Xbow, and Ice Wizard Tornado remained very popular. There wasn't much development in Xbow for the rest of 2020, but it was slowly creeping up more, and by November had a 7% use rate with a win rate of 52%. These rates are actually quite average, but it seemed like the Xbow was only getting stronger. Throughout the year, you would see more and more complaints about the Xbow calling for a nerf. This was a very controversial card, as many players fought back against those who claimed it needed a nerf. I gotta say, I've done research about many controversial cards, and reading through some of these Xbow discussion comments really make me a little disturbed of how rude and aggressive some people can be. Some of these comments I'm not even going to show. Despite the pushback on those calling for nerfs, Drew the community manager would essentially confirm an Xbow nerf on Twitter, responding to a comment pleading for a nerf, which basically led to a community civil war in the comments. But who knew what this Xbow nerf would be? This upcoming nerf would actually be the last change the Xbow has ever received to this day. People could complain all they wanted, but the inevitable day was approaching. So what would Supercell do to the Xbow after nearly 2 years without any changes? A card that was statistically balanced but very controversial. Well, it wasn't exactly a hard nerf, but instead a rework. It would get 5 different changes. The first 2 changes was changing its first hit attack time and its hit speed from 0.25 seconds back to 0.3 seconds, which is what it was before it bugged out back in 2017. I was never really sure what reducing the hit speed had to do with fixing that bug in the first place. Remember, that initial hit speed buff came in a maintenance break, not a set of balance changes. That 4% health buff from 2019 would also get reverted. Its lifetime would receive a change for the first time ever, being reduced from 40 seconds to 30 seconds. All of these nerfs would be compensated by a damage buff of 30%, so it did have a slightly higher DPS than before. One big interaction difference that came out of this was now it could two-shot skeletons instead of 3. This was Supercell's reasoning for the change. Xbow has been one of the most polarizing cards ever. We wanted to rework it to keep it a deadly threat, but lessen its power as a defensive building. Now the Xbow's attack is more powerful than ever, able to destroy enemies with fewer shots. But as a trade-off, the Xbow is more fragile and does not stay on the arena for nearly as long a time. I think this rework was certainly going in the right direction, decreasing its defensive capability immensely. It was hard to know at first if this was an overall buff or a nerf. However, after a few weeks, it was apparent that this rework made the card worse. Its use rate dropped and stayed at about 2 to 3%, with a win rate hovering around the low 40s, and it would stay this way for years. It had a couple tiny upticks here and there, but it was always dipping below average and most of the time was hardly being used. By the end of 2022, it was dipping as low as 1%, with very low win rates. In February of this year, Xbow 2.9 had a slight comeback due to the massive Archers buff, but it quickly fell even before the Archers got inevitably nerfed. Xbow was certainly a viable card, granted it was still very niche, as it's pretty much always been, but that effort that goes behind being able to play Xbow properly just isn't worth it for most people. Especially as the meta develops and new cards are added, the Xbow seemingly just gets more and more bad matchups. The Xbow isn't a fun card, and it's just overall not very good right now. Nowadays, the Xbow's rates are almost identical to what they were just a few weeks after its rework, maintaining a 2 to 3% use rate with a win rate in the mid to low 40s, gone unchanged for 2.5 years as of this video. Spell cycling was also nerfed a ton over the years. All spells used to do 40% of their damage to crown towers, but nowadays Fireball only deals 30, Rocket deals 25, and Log only 20. You'll occasionally see discussions of the dying population of Xbow players begging and pleading for a buff, but they would always be ignored by Supercell, who has shown no interest from what I could see in making any direct changes to the card in years. Most players do not want Xbow to be buffed due to the frustration it will inevitably cause if it's good, and people will often point to top players who are still succeeding with Xbow to this very day to defend the notion that it doesn't need a buff. There aren't many, but certainly a few who can still make the card work. It does have small upticks every so often, but what is the future for Xbow? Will Supercell keep the card in a worse off position like several other cards in order to minimize frustration, or will they take the chance on getting this card to a healthy spot again? Personally, I think Xbow is fine the way it is. It's much less frustrating to go against than it used to be, and I think it is the most unhealthy card for this game. I think an Elixir Golem Elite Barbarian double spawner meta would be better than having another defensive Xbow Rocket cycle meta. I know this is weird coming from someone who has advocated publicly for Witch and Wizard buffs, but I don't think I've ever had less fun in this game than during the days of the Xbow's peak. It's one of those cards that's simply better off being borderline useless for the overall health of the game. If Supercell can keep the Wizard and the Barbarian hut weak on purpose, they can surely do that with the Xbow as well. If Supercell does decide to change this card in any way though, I hope they will at least keep the lifetime the same, because I think 40 seconds was way too long. I sometimes wonder though if allowing the Xbow to target air again after all these years would fare better in the modern Clash climate. Although it was overpowered in 2016, it might be a bit more balanced now, with cards like Lava Hound in the game as a proper air tank. Seth, who is the head of balancing, even put out a tweet back in 2018 asking the same question. I think it may potentially make it much better on defense, but worse on offense, which seems like the wrong direction. It's probably a terrible idea, but I know it's a thought many have had and certainly would be interesting to see in this day and age. But let me know your thoughts about the Xbow and how you would change it. My bias may have come out there a little at the end, even though I do mostly try to stay unbiased for these videos. Nevertheless, thank you all for watching, and have a good one.